people join before we get started because I have my volume on and little beeps will keep coming up. And so just so it's not totally distracting, we'll give it about 1 more minute. But I was just welcoming everyone on this beautiful, like really, this might be a perfect Pacific Northwest day if you're in the Pacific Northwest. All right, well, I'm gonna go and get started because we've had a little pause right now in the beeps, just as I said that. And to welcome all of you, we're so excited to have you here today for Author Talk with Clyde W. Ford. My name is Emiko Atherton. I am the Executive Director of Social Venture Partners Seattle. And I'm going to introduce Clyde and tell you more about this. But before we do, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. Though we're all virtual, we are all seated somewhere today. I want to acknowledge that we are living on traditional land. Many of us who are joining on the call are in Seattle or King County. I am on the land personally right now, the Coast Salish people, including the Duwamish people. Clyde W. Ford is on the traditional land of the Lummi people. And we want to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish and Lummi tribes, past and present. I think we know that this does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land and original caretakers of the land we were on. So thank you. And if you're not on Duwamish or Lummi land, you can send out a link and you can look up what land you are on and take some time to review that. So again, I want to welcome you all as people join. This is an event that I have been looking forward to for months, and a really special event where we're able to talk with Clyde W. Ford, the author of many books, but the focus of our shared book club with Washington Women's Foundation and Progress Alliance this last spring called A Blood and Sweat. If I joined a little bit late, my name is Emiko Atherton, and I am the executive director of an organization called Social Venture Partners Seattle. We are an organization that works to really use philanthropy to advance racial justice and equity by sharing our time, our talent, our treasure, and our ties. And one of the things that we do is we learn and act together, both within SVP, but with our partner organizations, as I mentioned, so that we are both reflecting, but building community and working together to take action again to advance racial justice and equity. I wanted to just share, if you may be joining us for the first time, we've also had a book club that's been meeting and reading this book. And one of the things that we did within this was set group agreements when we read difficult material. And although this is, I think about half of this is going to be a conversation between Mr. Ford and myself, we'll have time for questions at the end. And so Letty, if you could share the group agreements. And I'll just give everyone a few minutes to just take that in, particularly when we're in a space where we're still building relationships or digesting difficult material. And so we wanted to share these all. These are ones that we use at SVP, but also ones that the group that was reading the book developed. So wanted to share that. And then moving on to the next slide. Again, I mentioned this has been a book club. We started, I think, gosh, January, it feels like years ago. The second year, we've been able to do a joint book club with the Washington Women's Foundation and Progress Alliance. And I want to give a special thank you to Lisa from Progress Alliance and Catherine from Washington Women's Foundation, as well as their amazing leaders, Maria Colby-Wolf at WWF and Dion Foster at Progress Alliance. When I always mention that when I started my role at SVP, and we all started within the last like 2 to 2.5 years, a lot of people asked us like, how are you different? How are you going to, I think somebody asked me like, who's your competition? And these names keep coming up. And the wonderful thing is, despite the pandemic, the three of us got together and really figured out we actually we wanted to collaborate. We're not, instead of being competitive, we could do more together. We all um, have separate but similar work, and the more we can do together, there's too much work, I think, for any of us to do alone. And so I love that this is the second year in celebrating this. So big thank you to them. And then I wanted to really introduce the author, Clyde W. Ford, who we are so honored to have join us today. I've gotten to speak with Clyde W. Ford leading up to this, as well as really both read and digest his work, and he's incredibly phenomenal. He was born in New York City, and he's the author of 13 works of fiction and nonfiction. In addition, Clyde's a psychotherapist, an accomplished mythologist, and a sought-after public speaker. In 2006, he received the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Award in African American Fiction. He was also, Clyde, if you haven't heard, lives in Bellingham, Washington, and has worked here. And he was named the Literary Lion by the King County Library System in 2006, 2007, 2008, and 2019. He's been voted the best writer of Bellingham, Washington in 2006 and 2007 by readers of the Cascadia Weekly. And in 2007, he received the Washington Mayor's Arts Award in Literature in Bellingham. He's currently a speaker for Humanities Washington, which is an affiliate of the NEH, where he presents a program entitled Let's Talk About Race around Washington State. He's participated in hundreds of media interviews. He's appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show, New Dimensions of Radio, and NPR. I think I've also seen him on a clip on Good Morning America. So if you want more of him, you can look that up afterwards. Right now, he lives in Bellingham, Washington, where he writes aboard his 30-foot trawler, which I just learned what that was, because I am not a boater, and he cruises the waters of the Inside Passage. So welcome, Clyde. Thank you so much. So the way this is going to work is I get the privilege of having really being able to speak with Clyde for about the first 25 minutes. And then from there, I will go ahead and open it up to questions. We are going to ask that you put your questions in the chat box. It just helps us manage them. It helps kind of pull those up. I'll then read them for Mr. Ford. As I mentioned, not everyone here, you didn't have to read the book. But so I wanted to start out, Clyde, and what can you tell us about the ideation of Blood and Sweat, and what led you, you've written so many books and works of art, like what led you to tell these stories?
Thanks, Emiko. And first, I do want to thank you for the invitation and this opportunity to speak with you and the book group at SVP that was so kind to take this on as a joint reading. So I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate being here today. I think one of the things that authors, at least I do as an author, is that if I'm interested in something, I want to write a book about it. That's the best way to learn, is when you have to write a book, because you have to explain it not only to yourself, but you got to explain it to your readers. And that means you really have to, I think, have some level of understanding the issues and ideas and subjects that you're interested in. But for this book, there's a lot more to it. My senior thesis in college, many, many, many decades ago, I don't even want to mention how long it was ago, although I will say it wasn't even this year that I did get a 50th anniversary invitation to the graduating class at Wesleyan University. So it's been a long time. But my senior thesis was on some of these issues. It was on Africans in early colonial America from 1619 to 1700. And to be honest, I went back and read my thesis. I still have a copy of it long before the internet. And I was surprised that it actually seemed pretty intelligible. And I was pleased to be able to read something that old and to get something from it and to use it as the basis, at least for a couple of chapters in this book. I think the other things that were really significant for me in this book is that I had the privilege and the honor of being a student and then later a friend and always being a mentee of two really towering figures in African American history, and that is the late Dr. Lerone Bennett and the late Dr. Vincent Harding, both of whom I had the opportunity to study with at the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta, Georgia, back in the 60s. And later, as I said, went on to become friends with them. The areas that they were able to explore very long ago in African American history really animated me, inspired me. And one of the great things for me in writing this book is that I could cover areas that both Lerone and Vincent covered with me, but do it in a way that added to their great scholarship, because so much of the information that is available to me wasn't available to them in the 60s, simply based on the research, the access to the internet, and the number of other scholars who have explored and unearthed material. So though all of those things came together, and I think the other thing that came together was a pandemic. I frankly didn't have a lot to do. I was at home, and it was very easy to just get up and come down to my writing room and figure out, okay, what are we going to do today? And it was to write. So those are really the basis for A Blood and Sweat.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And I think you started to share some insights into your writing process, which is so meticulously researched. And I just have to say, I loved how you use footnotes, like where you put them. But how do you approach like the creation of such an ambitious book?
Well, it's really interesting because not everybody loves that detail. A lot of people don't even want to know all of the facts behind that. But I'm of the belief, I think I grew up at a time, went to school at a time where if you can't document it, don't say it. And I
Mm,
also think that it's very important in the time that we live in, where truth seems to be fungible. I don't believe it is. I think things happen or they don't. It's not your opinion of what happened. It's a question of, did it take place or not? And so I think that is important. And I think it's important to document whatever assertions, statements you make. And that's one of the things I wanted to do as a researcher, as a historian. It's really important to me to be able to go back to source documents. In fact, even with my mentors, I would, Vincent and Lerone, I take their material, go back to the source documents that they referenced. And I was surprised that several times I found instances where what they said and even what they quoted did not match the source documents. And so I think that's really important. It's an opportunity for anybody who's interested to actually fact check the author. And when we as authors make mistakes, it's absolutely, I think, imperative on anybody who's interested to call us out on those mistakes. And I also think that providing those sources then allows the conversation to have a baseline of truth from which to work. And so the discussion we have doesn't start on what I would like to believe and what you would like to believe. Look, if Thomas Jefferson wrote something, we can go back to that as a statement of truth. It's not a belief. It's not an idea or a political philosophy we have. The guy wrote it. And if it's in the Emancipation Proclamation, that's a document that's actually there. It's in the National Archives. You can't argue about what's there. All you can do is you can certainly have an argument about the interpretation and meaning of it, but the literal words of these great documents, I think you need to have some reference for that, simply so that you can, in this day and age, remove the element of truth as being simply something that people believe. I don't believe that it's ever been that way. I think it's sad to see the extent to which this idea that truth is what you make it has somehow crept into the consciousness of so many people, particularly here in this country. So I wanted to make sure that this book was not a book that would lend itself to political speculation. You may not like the conclusions and my interpretations, but you can't argue with the references of facts. And I wanted to provide those references for that reason.
It's amazing. Kind of building off that question, you also, in addition to using primary sources, you included some dialogues, like mixing the primary source materials with narrative. And so I'd love for you to talk about that as well, kind of going from primary source to something more narrative.
Yeah, and one of the things that inspired me to do that was really the WPA, Writers Progress Administration programs in the 1930s that Franklin Delano Roosevelt implemented to give writers jobs during a very hard economic times with the Depression. And so pre-World War II, a cadre of writers was sent out in particularly to the South and other areas. Actually, every state had a WPA administration, and they interviewed people who were alive during important historical times, particularly slavery. So there's a huge volume of material available through the Library of Congress, which is the actual narratives of people who in the 1930s had lived through slavery and the end of those times. And I thought, wow, this is great because now you're reading real primary sources, which are dialogue. It wasn't so, and these, writers did not go out and do anything other. Often they'd actually take very early tape recorders, which would occupy an entire trunk of a car and record people speaking about their experience. And that was so powerful to be able to read that it seemed to me, wow, this would be great if we could start to do that in other ways. Now, obviously, I took some liberties, and I did mention that in that there are no source recordings of what somebody said in 1619. There's no source recordings of what people even said in the 1700s or 1800s. And so I did take liberties. There's no question about that. And the reason I did take those liberties, and I felt great about doing that, is a lot of people don't engage with just dry factual material. And so it seemed to me, well, here's an opportunity to help people engage with this material from the point of view of what would it be like if we engaged in conversation. My own feeling is that as long as you don't mix and choose political or actual factual material that's taken place, I think it's fine to have a variety of ways to present that factual material. And what I tried to do, and I think one of the best examples of that I'm actually pleased with how it turned out, is on the chapter on African Americans in the Age of Sail. I was able to take the book that Britton Hammond wrote, and it was a very slim volume published in the 1700s. Really the first African American author who was also a sailor. And I didn't feel right to just report the very dry, factual way he described his life. It seemed like, let's take the facts as he described his life and add what at least was a conjecture on how it might have been that he experienced those events. And so really it was my opportunity. And again, I take full ownership of that. By no means suggesting that any of us were able to capture what actually happened, but it's certainly a way to take facts and present them in perhaps a more palatable way to the reader.
Great. So, for me, this book, and I feel embarrassed to say, so there were so many surprises when I was reading it. Things that I felt like I should have known, as we that should have been part of my history. But I wanted to know what surprised you either in the writing process or history that you found as you were writing the book.
Yes, thanks, Emiko. And that's a great question. I think in an overall sense, which surprised me most is the extent to which in this day and age, particularly in Republican-controlled states, for example, there is an emphasis to suppress any of the information, particularly information that perhaps have not been revealed before or that goes against whatever the current political narrative is, to the point of burning books, banning books, and legislating against educators actually presenting the facts of historical information. And that's, I think, a very sad commentary on where we are as a country, that is the extent to which people feel they need to go to, in a sense, hide the truth of what's taken place. So I wanted to make sure that was something I did not do. And in many ways, while this is not a book about critical race theory, it's not a counter narrative to critical race theory, I simply wanted to make sure it was a book in which I didn't shy away from the truth wherever it fell, as long as I was able to document the truth as I understood the facts of the situation presented to me. So, that was kind of my starting point. And I would have to say that while I knew the general narrative of African American history from 1619 to the 1880s when this book started, in part because I've taught this in universities like Western Washington University here in Bellingham and written about it before. What surprised me was the detail in which things, for example, like the legislated violence against African American and Native Americans were really imprinted in the legislation. What surprised me was the extent to which those in power would actually go to legislate hatred, so that really America legally and legislatively was architected along the lines of racial hatred. That surprised me, and to find the evidence of that in the laws, in the discussions that took place between politicians, I think that was surprising. Another thing that was very surprising, and we may want to talk more about this later, for example, is the extent to which things like how we have developed a system of policing is not even what you're hearing about from, Black Lives Matter and those who are interested in police reform. It's so much deeper than that. It's so much more profound than that, that it really changed my understanding of what we need to do to change that. So I was surprised by that. I was also surprised about the extent to which those who we would call the founding fathers, and not that they were enslavers. I understood that. I knew that. That's been something that's gone on for a while. But I was surprised by the extent to which, for example, they were in debt and then use the actual men and women they had enslaved as collateral for their debt. That really, really surprised me. It was a little mind-boggling to see that written out in Jefferson's hand. Was, I think, more than damning. It was unbelievable, to be honest. So I found that at every turn there were things that surprised me in that way, revelations which for me I thought were very eye-opening, and I hope maybe they were for the reader. Part of the reason I wrote this book was that I wanted to get to my own truths about some of the important issues that were in front of the country in 2020 and 21, particularly issues around, police violence, issues around reparations. Again, this is not a book about reparations. It's not a book about police violence. But in trying to answer questions in my own mind about that, this is the book that certainly was involved with that. And perhaps the last thing I'd say, what surprised me, was the extent to which this country had actually gone down the line, gone down the road of making reparations to those that had been enslaved, and then walked that back, so that in this day and age, when we talk about reparations, while so much of the country feels like that shouldn't happen, this country actually went down the road so close to actually making that a reality. And I have to believe, and I do believe, that had the country been able to follow through, then we would not be faced with the same system of racial inequity in so many different areas that we are now, including the racial wealth gap.
Thank you for that. Hello and welcome to those who have joined us. For those of you who haven't had the honor yet of completing the book, I think one of the, if you just look at the title of Blood and Sweat, Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth, one of the things that I took away from this book that I mentioned, I felt actually embarrassed I didn't know, was how embedded into our history, and not just policy, but in the, as you mentioned, the forming of our policing, the forming of the American legal system, the forming of the limited liability company, how all of these things were not just used to perpetuate kind of white power and wealth, but were actually created or modified to do so. They were actually tools. And that's a huge, I think, takeaway for me. And I bring that up just in leading. I'm going to kind of piggyback off of something you mentioned in your last question, but in chapter 10, one of the chapters that prompted the most discussion for us in our book club, and the title of chapter 10 is I Can't Breathe, is you describe the rise of contemporary police in America from the hue and cry of the Statute of Winchester. And I was wondering if you could both, for everyone who hasn't been able to read up to chapter 10, if you could talk about the rise of contemporary policing and then talk more about the action steps you include to disrupt the current system and why they're so critical. And I can get, so maybe it's the what was it, and then what could we do to disrupt it, and why? So it's a three-part question, so I can go over it. I know we're going to
Sure,
be starting
sure,
with history,
sure,
but those of us that didn't have not yet had the honor of reading chapter 10.
sure. The funny thing for me was that in writing that chapter, I began from the assumption that police reform was really important and something that was possible in this country. And by the time I finished that chapter, I really was of the belief that there's no way that you can reform a policing system that is based the way this policing system is, that it has to be knocked down and you've got to build up from the beginning. So the history is straightforward, but in many ways unfortunate. And that history starts in Britain in the 13th century with the Statute of Winchester. And that statute was the basis upon which policing, even to this day, and you can go to any modern textbook on policing and read their homage really to the Statute of Winchester and how important that Statute of Winchester was. Now, you mentioned the phrase hue and cry, and that phrase hue and cry, which is found throughout early American policing and early American legislation and early American criminal history, is that hue and cry was what was instantiated, put into practice with the Statute of Winchester, where after dark, small European villages were supposed to then be patrolled in such a way that anyone who did not live in that village was considered guilty simply by appearing in that village after dark. And they were subject to arrest simply because they were there. The outsider was considered guilty until proven not guilty. And if the outsider ran, the people of the village, it was almost like a collective punishment situation. If they did not, and this is in the Statute of Winchester, raise hue and cry, basically meaning yelling that there's an outsider in the village and then chase that person, they themselves would be guilty under the Statute of Winchester. And I thought, look at how little has changed, where the general population feels they are empowered to enact violence and even summary judgment to people they consider outsiders. This just happened a couple of days ago on a subway in New York City, where a former Marine jumped in and choked a homeless Black man to death, feeling in some way empowered to do that. And the history of that is so clear that it is personally repulsive, but it's there in the history, and it goes back to the 13th century. Those laws were brought over to this country with the colonists, and those laws became the basis of American policing. American policing was really put in place as a way of controlling and supervising the labor force. And the same phrases, hue and cry, are in the early American policing legislation, where populations are identified as those who are acceptable and those who are others, and the others are basically people of color. So in the early America, it was African Americans who were held mostly enslaved, but some were free, and also Native Americans. And the white population was empowered and demanded of them to, if a person was attempting to escape enslavement, then the white population was empowered by law to go after them. And if in the course of chasing them, that person was killed, they could be assured of complete immunity. So if you look at what took place in the formative years of policing in this country, and you match that against what's going on right now, you see this very, very unfortunate line spectrum where you can just trace it way back before even, as I said, what folks in Black Lives Matter and police reform trace it. It's back before slave patrols. It's really baked into the kind of legal and law enforcement system that came over to this country from England. And what I say in the book is, look, the Statute of Winchester was what, 1250? That is almost, not quite 800 years ago. There is nothing else in our society that we would feel good about saying is based on something 800 years ago that doesn't need changing. And certainly it is true with policing. It needs to be changed. I don't believe anymore that the current system of policing we have makes people safe. I think it's a recipe to actually have violence. I don't believe that what we think of as being empowered as a country because we think the Second Amendment gives everybody the right to have guns, and it really, really doesn't. The Second Amendment was based on militias, and those militias were specifically the code word. I'm not saying it, it's right in the constitutional discussions, the code word for patrolling enslaved African Americans. I don't believe that, even if you want to take the Second Amendment at face value, I've never seen a picture of Benjamin Franklin with an AR-15. So something is wrong in this country when the basis of people feeling safe is their ability to enact violence against other people. We've got to figure that out better. I don't think we reform that. I think you have to look at that right from the beginning. Where does it come from? Let's get rid of those initial, where it comes from, and let's start this from the beginning. Now, obviously, in the process of doing that, I don't believe you just take away all the money from the policing and shut down everything, but I do think you need to have a parallel process where in that parallel process, one of the things you're doing is looking at not how you reform policing, but how you build public safety so it works.
That's great. And could you just elaborate more on those actions, like action steps for me or those of us who are in the book club or those of us who are with you right now? Like, what do those action steps look like?
Yeah, so one of the things, and this just gets a huge pushback from many people in this country, but one of the important action steps that I believe we need to take is to just get rid of this idea that the Second Amendment allows everybody in this country to have guns. It does not. It's never said that. A well-regulated militia, which the Second Amendment does state, had everything to do with the North's appeasement of the South to allow them to maintain a patrol of non-empowered legally law enforcement, basically citizens with guns, to do one thing, and that is to patrol and police enslaved individuals. So if anybody wants to be a strict constructionalist in terms of the Constitution, go back to the discussions that happened in the constitutional conventions in the late 1700s and read what the actual discourse was between those individuals from the North and South, and read how the North appeased the South to allow them to have militias that would enable them to control their enslaved individuals. So if you feel that's the basis for the kind of gun regulation we need today, I don't know, I don't know that we have much to say. I don't feel that way. I don't feel you base laws on what happened in a time period where America was enslaving individuals and using violence to protect that. I think you need to change that. You need to change the basis upon which those laws, particularly the laws around guns and the laws around violence and the laws around policing, are related. So I think that's a really, really important step to take. Another important step I think that we need to take is we need to put the public back in public safety. And I said that in a number of ways in the book, but the idea is that we have this system set up where we have a policing force which patrols who we consider to be the others in our society. And I was very both sad, but I thought important to read a statement made by the mayor of Minneapolis, or the former mayor of Minneapolis, in the New York Times in an op-ed that related to her feelings about what had happened shortly after George Floyd was killed. And what she said, I think, was very revealing. She said, look, the reason that we even have the kind of policing in Minneapolis that would lead to George Floyd's death is because the good people of this city, who would consider themselves progressive and liberal, also are subject to believing that they don't want their property in any way invaded by the others in this society. And this woman, not an African-American woman, Caucasian woman who was the mayor, said really clearly, if we're going to change this, we have to change the beliefs of the people, not just the actions of the police. And I've got to believe she's on to something there. She's on to the idea that if we're going to make changes in how we have public safety in this society, we've got to start fundamentally on what we believe about public safety. And those are very deep changes that I think not as many people are willing to sign on to, as they might even be disgusted about how policing is taking place right now. So those are some of the ideas. I think we got to think very deeply about what policing means in a modern society, and it's not what I see right now.
That's great. Thank you. Earlier in our conversation, you talked about reparations, and I wanted to know if you would be willing to share some of your ideas for reparations.
Sure, and I've done this in a number of venues, and in particular, I think a couple of years ago, I wrote a Seattle Times op-ed about the way forward with reparations. And also want to say at this time, I'm really enjoying looking at what's going on in California, where there is a reparations commission that has gone through a number of steps in terms of what it means to have reparations for a period of enslavement in this country. And recently, just 2 days ago, actually came out with a dollar figure on that. I think that's an important step forward. My take on this, and what I thought was important, and I certainly wrote about in the book, was the idea that reparations for slavery were actually seriously passed by the Congress of the United States and signed into law by President Lincoln in 1865. Now, many people know this as 40 acres and a mule. It was way beyond that. Basically, what happened is that Lincoln had no plan for what to do with African Americans after the North won the Civil War. And the other piece of this is that the Emancipation Proclamation, contrary to most people's beliefs, you simply need to read the document, didn't free slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation freed Black men and women in the areas of the country that Lincoln didn't have control over. That is, the states that is seceded. So the bizarre piece of this is that after the Emancipation Proclamation was put forth and signed into law, you could not hold a slave in Mississippi, but you could in Massachusetts. And it's right there in the document. It's not my belief. It's simply what's there. And there are a number of places, newspapers that pointed this out. The importance of that is one of Lincoln's generals, Sherman, came to him and said, look, we have a problem here. The problem is we have issued a statement of freeing a population that was enslaved, but we don't have a plan for what to do with that population. Lincoln's plan was get a good job and don't take violence against the people who enslaved you. That's not a plan. That is simply a statement of aspiration. So Sherman then actually went to the South, consulted with some of the African American leaders of that time, and asked them a simple question. The question was, what would be the basis of reparations for this period of enslavement? Would you like to be integrated back into Southern society in such a way that you had equal power? Or would you like to do something else? And to a person, and this is recorded again, which is really great to be able to read the remarks of the folks that Sherman went to, the sentiment was, we don't think that Southern society would ever welcome us in. We would like to be able to have self-determination and establish our own basis for living, governance, education, etc. Sherman said, fine. And then with these individuals, developed a reparation plan, which was to extend to all enslaved people or formerly enslaved people, first 400,000 acres of land along the southeastern coast of the United States, including the islands off the coast. And as that was beginning to be implemented, and some 40,000 families actually had taken part in that, added to that was another 500,000 acres of land. So we're talking about almost 1 million acres of land in the southeast of the United States that was to be distributed, began to be distributed to formerly enslaved people. It's a little bit longer story than that, but that's essentially the outline. And so then after Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson came into power as president, one of the first acts he did was to revoke this 40 acres and a mule plan, which is what the Sherman Plan was often called. And therefore, immediately, what ceased was the distribution of land to formerly enslaved people. So that is an important piece of history, and it's important for a number of reasons. One, that both Republicans and Democrats, and I've got to say, if you're looking at American history during this post-Civil War period, you have to switch in your mind who was doing what. Republicans were whom we would consider Democrats today, and Democrats were whom we would consider Republicans today, but it doesn't matter. Both of them came together. Conservatives and liberals, progressives and regressives came together with the idea that reparations for slavery made sense and passed that plan. And then it was a political decision that happened with the assassination of Lincoln that reversed that plan. So when people ask me, where do we even look at in terms of the dollar amount for reparations? And again, California came up with the figure of 800 billion. My answer is pretty simple. That land that was to be allocated to African Americans is well known. The maps are still there. They're in the Library of Congress. You can go back to them. So start with that land and look at its value in today's economy. And that, to me, would be a pretty fair place to start with a dollar figure on reparations. And I have to say, it includes some of the most wealthy and rich parts of the Southeast United States. But that's what was taken from African Americans. That is probably one of the biggest ways of helping to close the wealth gap. Now, whether you just give that out to people or whether you figure out other ways to enable that distribution of wealth, I'm all for that kind of discussion, but what I'm not open for is the idea that you should not be giving reparations to people of color, African Americans who were enslaved, particularly when America attempted to do this at one time, but just didn't follow through. So follow through. That would be my question. That would be my answer.
That's great. One of the things we did in our last book club is I mentioned at the beginning, we take time to learn so that we can turn that into action. And many people are really galvanized to address the racial wealth gap. And I was wondering if you have any particular groups or movements we might want to look at as we move from kind of reading and reflection of your book into action.
Sure. And again, thanks, Emiko, for that question. I think it is an important question. And there's two things that I would think people might want to consider. I know in that op-ed, I suggested that Washington State, not California, ought to be a leader in reparations because Washington State has a history of that. Washington State has a history of knowing how to deliver, debate, reparations, because that's exactly what they did with the Japanese survivors of internment camps during World War II. So there's an incredible history to rely on. I think here in Washington State, what would be really important, and I hope the coming governor, because we know that Jay Inslee has now decided he won't run, but that the next governor will at least impanel a reparations committee, as did Gavin Newsom in California. So any work that anyone is interested in doing in supporting the establishment of a reparations commission here in the state of Washington, I think that would really be great. I think we should have one, but it's going to take the population actually advocating for one. And so that would be something I would say, yeah, let's work towards that. Secondarily, NARC, NAARC, the National African American Reparations Commission, is an organization that you can both join and support. And if we're going to do anything here in Washington State along those lines, I think NARC would be more than happy to invite any that kind of discussion and entertain what it could do to support a local or a regional organization like that. But NARC is also an organization you can join. You can go online and look for NAARC, or National African American Reparations Commission, and that'd be a great place to start. I think that's a very important discussion to have. And once you have the framework of an organization like NARC or a state commission, then the actual process of how you might contemplate reparations, that can be debated. It was debated in California, and I think that's a great debate to have. But all those ideas then are taking place within the framework of an organization that has a goal, that has a vision, that if we're going to talk about closing the racial wealth gap, we need to go back historically and look at how it was created and redress those things. The other important piece that I think people can look at is I think Washington State needs to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I actually think the entire country needs to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there are some good models for that, although, we got to understand that anytime you deal with people, it's kind of a sloppy process and it's not perfect. But certainly our neighbors to the north, Canada, attempted and are continuing to attempt to do that in terms of the insults and the challenges that country has inflicted upon the indigenous population, and I think that's at least a good place to start. We're starting to see a little bit of that here in this country with Deb Haaland, the Commissioner of Lands, and what she's doing as a Native American woman in terms of at least looking at the extent to which the church have ripped young Native Americans from their homes and trying to redress that. I think we need to do that with the situation around enslavement and what that happened. South Africa, also an example of truth and reconciliation. Not perfect, but it's an important start. And one of the things I'm quick to point out is, look, if you're going to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think you do need that, then the first thing you have is truth. You can't have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission until you have the truth, and the truth is based on the historical situation. And if we're talking about enslavement, then the historical situation of enslavement and what that meant in this country.
Thank you. I'd now love to invite those of you in our virtual audience to share your questions in the chat box. While you're doing that, I'm going to ask my final question of you. Don't share everything because I actually asked you this about an hour ago as we were coming on. But what can you share that you're working on now? What can we look forward to?
Yes, and I think I told you earlier on that some of what I'm working on, I'm under NDA and I can't talk about it, but it is a book. It is books. But I am under contract with HarperCollins for a sequel to Of Blood and Sweat. And so I'm hoping to get that out sometime soon. So that's one of the big projects that I'm working on. The other thing that I do, which I'm also very pleased about, and it's related to this book, is as a consultant, I've been in a number of nonprofits and other businesses to look at what they could do to become a more inclusive organization. And when I was doing that for HarperCollins, I later got a call from the president who invited me to be her advisor in terms of their new partnership with the Martin Luther King Jr. estate. And so I work with HarperCollins on a weekly basis and with the Martin Luther King Jr. estate to see what we can do to reinvigorate Martin Luther King Jr.'s message for a new generation and a new age. We've got some incredibly exciting projects that we're doing. For example, each year we reprint the I Have a Dream speech with a special introduction. This year it was with Amanda Gorman. And so we're doing this. We're doing a number of book projects that I think will add to this idea that there are messages from King and the history of that time that are very relevant to what's going on today. So those are the things that I'm involved with right now.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to read the first question, and it says, "So appreciate your book. I learned so much. I'm curious how you were able to trace all the way back to William Tucker and how Anthony and Isabel came to him."
Yeah, that's a great question. And it also speaks to the information that is available to us today that wasn't available, 50 years ago. But the first way that I traced back to William Tucker and the fact that he was the enslaver of both Anthony and Isabella, also often considered the first plantation owner in America, was you go back to the census data. And census data is always a good way to start looking at historical information. Turns out that there were census taken. They weren't called census in the 1600s. They were called musters. And there was a muster taken in 1624 and 1625 in colonial Virginia. So there are some copies of that muster, and it was a process of thumbing through them. Of course, I wasn't the only person to do this. Some other scholars had done that. And there is an entry for William Tucker. And along with that entry at the bottom is a listing that he did. He was the enslaver of Anthony and Isabella. Now, because it was 1624, there aren't a lot of options about how Anthony and Isabella got here, because there were only two ships up to that point that had brought enslaved Africans who were to be enslaved to this country. And I also just want to say here that there's a really good chance that Anthony and Isabella were not enslaved individuals. They were indentured servants. And I know that I talk a lot about in the book, but my belief is that they were not enslaved, but they were indentured servants. And yes, they were on the far end of the spectrum of how they were treated as indentured servants, but there was that is a difference with an important distinction. So again, there weren't a lot of ways in which Africans were brought to the United States by 1624. The two principal ways was with that first ship, the White Lion, and then with the sister ship to the White Lion, which also visited Virginia in 1620. So there's a really good possibility. We don't have any documentation for sure, but there's a stronger than very plausible reason to believe that Anthony and Isabella were on that first ship of Africans who came to this country. Now, the other way that it's possible to trace back some of that history is William Tucker was pretty important in early colonial history. So he was on the Virginia councils. He was very involved in suppressing Native Americans, even poisoning Native Americans during peace talks. I mean, this wasn't, a nice guy. But so that record is available to us. And so you can get some information about who William Tucker was and the fact that he was in charge of the garrison that was at the point of land where the White Lion carrying those 20 some odd Africans docked. So he would have been right there at the beginning. And the other way that I was able to trace that back is that William Tucker, or at least that child of Anthony and Isabella, that child's descendants still exist and actually have a society where they meet regularly and obviously have oral family history, which goes down through the ages as well. So there's that, that kind of information is there, and you can access it. It takes a little bit of time to do the research. Not every reference is as complete as the other. And I even remember looking at the musters. Not all the musters are complete. And so you got to kind of put all of that together. But when you add it up, put it all together, store it in the same file on your computer, and then read it as a whole, you get a very good picture of what most likely happened during that early period of American history.
Thanks for sharing that. Got one last question. It's for some people that gathered in person to hear you today. And it says, I appreciated the chapter focused on the origins of many of the New York financial institutions. Do you know of any particular actions for reparations that these financial institutions may be taking, or any efforts towards truth and reconciliation by acknowledging the origins of their founding assets and profits?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can the last one, yes, at least in terms of finally being dragged into stating the truth of some of their origins. It was really George Floyd's murder, which caused many of these financial institutions to come forward. Look, there have been suits as early as 2003 against this is not in this country, although it's related to what you're saying, against Lloyd's of London. And the typical response, and this was true of Lloyd's of London, true of Chase Manhattan Bank, Citibank, Wells Fargo, was to say it didn't happen. It just didn't happen. It reminds me a lot of kind of the Trump response to truth, which is to deny it and deflect it. And so that was the first response. And there was a suit by 10 African Americans against Lloyd's of London because Lloyd's insured slave ships and insured those who were enslaved. And Lloyd's again said, just didn't happen. If it did happen, and then there was a little bit of, if it did happen, it was so long ago, we don't have any records. Well, a lot of that is just pure BS because the records do exist. You can find them. And so finally, by, I don't know, 2018, you were starting to get companies, maybe in this country, Chase and a couple of places a little bit earlier than that, were saying, okay, we'll tell you the truth. The truth is, yes, we were founded by banks which held large number of enslavement and women as collateral. Lloyd's came out with a statement, we did insure the slave trade, and their business didn't fall apart because they did that. So yes, there has been some level of truth telling, and I'm very thankful for it. And the other fact of the matter, which is really the first part of that question, is those are the institutions to which I believe reparations commissions should go to and say, you know what, you got to be a part of the solution. You were part of the problem. Now you also have to be part of the solution, because yes, they were built, this financial institutions in this country were built on the bodies of enslaved men and women. And to be honest, the process started with Jefferson, who used the enslaved men and women he held as collateral for the great debt that he owned. And that documentation is right there in the National Archives, where he writes to his creditors, look, I will pay you back, and I guarantee this against using, and he names by name the enslaved men and women he had. You can use them as collateral. That opened up a whole line of financial instruments, which then would use African Americans or Africans as collateral for debt. We got from that instruments like packaged derivatives and all of the other things that we hear about, and perhaps some of us participate in investing. You can trace so much of that back to how the banks initially used African Americans, as the backing for the various loan packages that they have. So I believe it was one author who said, you could be an individual who lived in France and still be supporting slavery in America, even though it was outlawed in France, by simply investing in these companies who ultimately used and often owned slaves to back the mortgages and other financial instruments that they had. That was an important part of that research. And again, the two conclusions that come out of that is, has been some fact telling, and now there needs to be taking some responsibility for the role that these institutions played.
Thank you. There's so much to digest and think about, but just wanted to thank you on behalf of Social Venture Partners and Washington Women's Foundation and Progress Alliance. It was truly an honor. I can't wait to read. It sounds like there will be a follow-up to A Blood and Sweat, as well as really look into, and we'll send out information about a reparations commission, the truth and reconciliation work, I think calls to action for all of us to do together. How do we take this and not just reflect, but act. And so just huge thank you, Mr. Ford. If you have not read the book, or if you'd like to buy additional copies and share those with friends and family and colleagues, we encourage you to do so at one of your local bookstores. Many of us ordered our books from Parable, which is a Black-owned bookstore in Tacoma. I know that is really looking for support right now. So we'll send that link out, but it's parabletacoma.com. We here right now at Social Venture Partners are around the corner from an old favorite of mine, Elliott Bay Books, another great place to buy it. And there's also a few locations here again in King County of Third Place Books. So those are all great places to support locally owned small businesses and support Mr. Ford in this work, because we look forward to more. It was such a pleasure. I want to invite you to continue if you're interested in meeting with us in person and continuing this conversation. Letty, if you could share the final slide. Social Venture Partners is gathering next week. That's Wednesday evening. We will be at the Daybreak Star Indian Cultural Center, which is we're in Discovery Park. We're going to gather, we're going to celebrate kind of all the work we've done over the last winter. We're going to eat great food and drink great beverages, all provided by United Indians for All Tribes Foundation, which is both an SVP grantee, but also will be catering and owns the space. It's a really special space, as well as a great discussion with Amy Liu from Microsoft, and she and I will be talking about the role all of us have in philanthropy. It is free and you can register on our website. So really excited about that. Welcome all of you to come, but again, just huge thank you. Huge thank you, Mr. Ford. This was, I know I've already ordered a few more copies, so I hope you have you didn't mention it, but I hope you have a really nice summer boat trip planned as well. We'll get all that writing done, so.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And, Emiko, I really appreciate the work that you and your partner organizations are doing to make the world that we and our descendants will have that is more equitable and just. So really appreciate what you're doing. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye.